Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Subletti. We're on chapter 33, which starts on page 469. It's titled Old Robbers, and it starts with a quote by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow from The Quadroon Girl, written in 1842. And we all know that quadroons are half blacks mixed with whites. The slaver led her from the door. He led her by the hand to be his slave and par amour in a strange and distant land. The sturdy brick dwelling house at 1315 Duke Street in Alexandria, Virginia, was built in the 1810s when Alexandria was part of the District of Columbia. From 1828 to 1837, it was the home and office of shipping entrepot of Franklin and Armfield, the largest slave trading company in American history, whose existence almost exactly coincided with the two terms of Andrew Jackson's presidency. Inscribed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1978, it now houses the Urban League of Northern Virginia and their Freedom House Museum. The house was the master structure for a complex with three now vanished courtyards. Enclosing the courtyards was a two-story multi-structure jail, newly whitewashed, in the words of Ethan Allen Andrews, an anti-slavery Bostonian who paid a surprise visit there in July of 1835 and was readily admitted and given a tour by John Armfield. It had a separate facilities for men, the West Yard, and women, the East Yard, a kitchen, a tailor shop, and a stable. Andrews allowed that the facility was clean and that the inmates were well dressed and everything about them had a neat and comfortable appearance for a prison. The 1830s census enumerated or counted 145 people being held there, though the evenness of the numbers suggests that the census taker might have accepted Armfield's word rather than count heads. It was counted that there was one male under 10 and four females under 10. There were 50 males between the ages of 10 and 24 and 50 females between the ages of 10 and 24. There were 20 males between the ages of 26 and 36 and 20 females between the ages of 24 and 36. The captives were mostly strangers to each other, freshly and forcibly removed from their families and their familiar worlds. They were being held until the next ship sailed out or until the annual coffle began marching. If they had been purchased during the off season, they might remain there for months. Andrews noted that they are often chained at night while at the depot at Alexandria, lest they should overpower their masters. Alexandria had formerly been a thriving port, but it was losing out to Baltimore. Federal law stipulated that public buildings could only be erected on the other northern side of the Potomac, that is, on the Maryland side. So Alexandria, on the Virginia side, got no federal offices. Instead, the slave trade was a key business for the town. So that explains to you why so much, even to this very day, is developed on one side of the river and the other side is so poor. Across the Potomac, 6 miles away, the slave trade was disturbingly visible in Washington City. Couples trampled through the streets of the nation's capital daily. Everyone knew where the slave jails were, and everyone walked past the open air auctions. Foreign diplomats were astounded to see such a thing in the country that had propagandized so heavily its commitment to liberty, but it only believed in liberty for the white man, not for the black, the brown, the red. There was no comparable spectacle in Europe where chattel slavery did not exist. Anti slavery people saw it, not incorrectly, but as a shameful proof that slave owners ran their government. Many townspeople heartily disliked it, especially the women. And this is where we get the notion that white women are our friends, but they're not. They only didn't like it because it didn't give them power. But slavery was fundamental to Washington City. Slaves built it and slaves ran it on a daily basis. Starved of infrastructural resources by conservative politicians from Jefferson on, legally unable to govern itself, boasting a grand capital and the White House, but lacking gaslight in its dark streets until 1848. Washington City was a dirty, disease-ridden thin that abounded with crooks, prostitutes, slaves, slave traders, and congressmen, the latter of whom typically lived in boarding houses. About 6% of the city's residents were free black people in 1800, a percentage that grew after 1806 when Virginia began requiring manumitted slaves to leave the state. So when they got manumitted, they had to leave Virginia. They had to leave their families. They had to leave everything they ever knew in order to be free. Because again, the greatest threat to a slaveholder is not is a free black person because you give the enslaved black person something to aspire towards. The District of Virginia was the perfect site from which to command the slave trade from the upper to the lower South, with Alexandria as its port. Its water communication via the Potomac to the Atlantic made it practical to sail captives down to the Gulf of Mexico, up the Mississippi to New Orleans, and on to Natchez, leaving South Carolina out of the loop entirely. So they cut off they cut off South Carolina, which has so vehemently advocated for slavery. Financial and legal enterprise was easily at hand in the nation's capital, where all these prostitutes, slaves, slave traders, crooks, and congressmen were. It was adjacent to the largest, most prestigious slave selling territories, those of Virginia and Maryland. Alexandria rose as a slave trade center with the building of Washington, D.C. By 1802, an Alexandria grand jury grievance decried the practice of persons coming from distant parts of the United States into the district for the purpose of purchasing slaves, where they exhibit, to our view, a scene of wretchedness and human degradation, disgraceful to our characters as citizens of a free government. True, it is that these dealers in the persons of our fellow men collect within this district from various parts numbers of those victims of slavery and lodge them in some place of confinement until they have completed their numbers. They are then turned out in our streets and exposed to view, loaded with chains as though they had committed some heinous offense against our laws. But again, they only saw white people as free citizens and their fellow men. Even in this statement, they're referring to the slave traders as their fellow men, not the slaves or the enslaved people. This was the world of small time tavern traders. By 1806, if not earlier, slaves were being sold in Alexandria at the Indian Queen at King and Water Streets, which was licensed to sell horses and carriages. The Indian Queen came under the management of Elias P. Legg, who had previously traded in slaves, while he was the tavern keeper of the Bell Tavern, where he had done well enough to open his own operation. Greetings, MG2. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. We're talking about how slavery looked in the Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. areas during slavery in the early 19th century. As Legg worked his way up to buying a plantation, his tavern became for a time the main slave marker of Alexandria. An advertisement in the Alexandria Gazette of February 15th, 1825, gives Tennessee, which was still a slave importing state, as a destination, saying, "Slaves wanted. The subscriber will at all times pay the highest price in cash for slaves, either single or in families. Letters addressed to me in Alexandria will be promptly attended to. 60 or 70 slaves at this time expressly to go to Tennessee. E.P. Legg." So as you can see, he was willing to keep families together, which is an interesting thing because usually they wanted single slaves to sell up and down the river so that they didn't have any familial ties to give them any sense of belonging and togetherness. So this, as inhumane as this action was actually quite compassionate on his part because he was willing to buy whole families of enslaved people. It doesn't say whether he kept them together or not, but he was willing to buy them all at the same time. So imagine being purchased with your wife and your children, or your husband and your children, or just your children. And then as you were marched up and down the Mississippi River from Virginia to Mississippi over to Tennessee to Natchez, that you were sold off piece by piece as you went along the way in this coffle where you were chained to this other enslaved person walking up and down the river. I'm just saying, this is the reality. Prior to 1812, a slave taken from Alexandria County to Washington County for the purpose of sale became free. Then Congress passed an act on June 24th, 1812, that allowed slave owners from one of the counties to remove slaves to the other, but did not allow a person from Alexandria to purchase a slave in Washington, or a person in Washington to purchase a slave in Alexandria for removal to Alexandria or Washington, respectively. The exact legal situation for slave commerce between the two counties thus had a somewhat unsettled status under the law. But generally, the presumption was that while slaves could be sold in the district, they could not be brought into the district for the purpose of sale. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. We're talking about some of the things that they were doing in the DMV area around the early 19th century, which was the 1800s, regarding slavery and how they contradicted themselves and how they were trying to write laws that empowered the slave owner to be able to transport his property from one place to another, even though they went through free states. The District of Columbia, then, major communications hub that it was, functioned mainly as a transshipment point for slaves brought in Maryland and Virginia or kidnapped from the North and destined for the South. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. As the interstate slave trade became big business, its largest player was Isaac Franklin, who lived from 1789 to 1846. His astute business sense allowed him repeatedly to time the market just right. Born in territorial Tennessee, the grandson of a Huguenot, Franklin had two brothers who were already in the slave trade with an office in New Orleans. They brought him in at the age of 18 to make runs down the Cumberland, the Ohio, and the Mississippi rivers, thus familiarizing him with the territory. Franklin had the good fortune to be from Nashville, which served as a base for both Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk. He built up his stake, plying the same course Jackson had a generation earlier, trafficking slaves from Nashville to Natchez, which Franklin was doing by 1819, if not earlier. In 1824, during the Virginia slave purchasing trip, he struck up a friendship with North Carolina slave trader John Armfield, the one we talked about earlier, who had the largest slave trading business in the DMV area, a stagecoach driver at the time who was doing the same. The two became partners, and in the classic merchant family manner, Armfield married Franklin's niece, Martha Franklin, and moved to Alexandria. With good relationships at multiple banks, Franklin was the best networked and best capitalized slave trader. He understood clearly the implications of the country's demographic shift to the Southwest and the advantages for the slave trading firm of having a presence over the entire geographical footprint of the slave labor system. By establishing a headquarters in Alexandria and sealing the partnership with strategic marriage, Franklin connected his Nashville base to the nation's capital. From there, he connected by water with the nation's greatest internal port, Baltimore, the great exporting port, New Orleans, which was approaching the peak of its national influence, and on to Natchez. Under the anti regulatory climate of the Jackson administration, Franklin brought a new level of professionalism to the interstate slave trade. Remember, his slaves were well housed and looked clean, considering the fact that they were slaves. Franklin and Armfield's business co-partnership was founded on February 29th, the leap year day, 1828, and their first newspaper advertisement offering to buy slaves ran in May, saying, "Cash in market." The subscribers, having leased for a term of years the largest three-story brick house on Duke Street in the town of Alexandria, D.C., formerly occupied by General Young, we wish to purchase 150 likely young Negroes of both sexes between the ages of 8 and 25 years. Persons who wish to sell will do well to give us a call, as we are determined to give more than any other purchasers that are in the market or that may hereafter come into the market. So they were saying that they were willing to pay the highest price for slaves. Any letters addressed to the subscribers through the post office at Alexandria will be promptly attended to. For information, inquire at the above described house, as we can at all times be found there. Franklin and Armfield. There was, needless to say, no federal opposition to this perfectly legal trade, especially during the Jackson years, which were 1829 to 1837, when their business boomed. That was because Congress made the laws for the District of Columbia. The slave trade in the district was a focal point of the anti slavery activism. Congressman Charles Minor of Pennsylvania, in his final days as a lame duck before vacating his seat, bravely introduced in 1829 a resolution into the House of Representatives, one that he knew would not pass, for the gradual abolition of slavery in the district. His speech in support of the measure, reproduced in the emerging abolitionist press, began: Slave dealers, gaining confidence from impunity, have made the seat of the federal government their headquarters for carrying on the domestic slave trade. The public prisons have been extensively used, perverted from the purposes for which they were erected, for carrying on the domestic slave trade. Offices of the federal government have been employed, derived emoluments from carrying on the domestic slave trade. Private and secret prisons exist in the district for carrying on this traffic in human beings. That's what was brave about this statement, his acknowledgement of the humanity of Black people. The trade is not confined to those who are slaves for life, but persons having a limited time to serve are brought by the slave dealers and sent where redress is hopeless. Others are kidnapped and hurried away before they can be rescued. Instances of death from the anguish of despair exhibited in the district mark the cruelty of this traffic. Instances of maiming and suicide, executed or attempted, have been exhibited growing out of the traffic within the district. Free persons of color coming into the district are liable to arrest, imprisonment, and sale into slavery for jail fees if unable, from ignorance, misfortune, or fraud, to preserve their freedom. This is what they want to go back to, where if you don't have your documents and your papers correctly, they can just throw you in jail and ship you off somewhere. There was slave trading in all three towns of the District of Columbia. John Beatty's business at what became the 3200 block of O Street in Georgetown was established in 1760. In the 19th century, McCandless Tavern at M Street and Washington Avenue was a notorious slave trader spot. Particularly visible in Washington, because of their location, were Roby's Tavern at 7th and Maryland, and one block over and 2 blocks down, Williams Slave Jail at 8th and B Street, now called Constitution Avenue. Williams was where the kidnapped Solomon Northup regained consciousness after being kidnapped, and where he was beaten by trader James Birch, Burch, instead of Birch in Northrup's spelling. Before becoming one of the captives, Birch regularly shipped to Theophilus Freeman, his partner, in New Orleans. The U.S. jail in Washington made money by housing captives in transit. Representative Minor noted that 742 people being trafficked by traders have been housed there during the previous 5 years, and told Congress of how, when visiting the jail, he saw a female prisoner there with 3 or 4 children with her, one still at the breast, and he asked her story. She was a slave, but had married a man who was free. By him, she had 8 or 9 children. Moved by natural affection, the father labored to support the children, but as they attained an age to be valuable in the market, perhaps 10 or 12, the master sold them. One after another was taken away and sold to the slave dealers. She had now come to an age to be no longer profitable as a breeder, and her master had separated her from her husband and all the associations of life, and sent her and her children to your prison for sale. She was waiting for a purchaser and seemed to me to be more heartbroken than any creature I had ever seen. Though many slave traders were operating, Franklin and Armfield's operation quickly dominated the market. Armfield held down the Alexandria office on Duke Street, supervising the buying and ran the shipping. Armfield also drove a large annual coffle southward in the summer. Since the firm had its own jail, Armfield could afford to buy one or a few slaves at a time and pin them up at Duke Street until he had accumulated a coffle full, and then drive the coffle down to get a jump on the fall slave selling season in Natchez. Greetings, Arbiter 567, who's asking, was this in Senegal? No, this was in the United States of America, in the Washington D.C. area, in the early 1800s, in the early 19th century, which was the 1810s through the 1830s. Most coffles contained 50 or 60 or at most 100 captives, but G.W. Feathershaw estimated the coffle of Armsfield that he encountered as having 300, which, if not an exaggeration, is as large as coffles ever got and represented a major logistical and security effort. By chance, Featherstonhaugh encountered Armfield a second time on a stagecoach. He described him as a queer, tall animal, about 40 years old, with dark black hair, round as if he were a Methodist preacher, immense black whiskers, a physiognomy not without 1 or 2 tolerable features, but singularly sharp, and not a little polite, piratical, and repulsive. Armfield was dressed entirely in black, except for a broad brimmed white hat adorned with a black crape. The latter, perhaps worn in homage to Andrew Jackson, who perpetually wore mourning crape for his deceased wife Rachel. Featherstonhaugh quoted Armsfield as saying of Jackson, "The old general is the most greatest and most completest idea of a man that had ever lived." You got to remember, America wants a strong man all the time. And in his opinion, because of the Trail of Tears and because of all the violence and because Jackson didn't hold any punches and Jackson could hold a grudge, he thought that Jackson was the greatest man that ever lived. Armfield's enslaved valet, Pompey, explained to Featherstonhaugh that the trader was over fond of opinions and brandy, which kept him feeling ill. Except for the summer coffle, Franklin and Armfield did all their trafficking by sea, connecting the Chesapeake, the source of the wholesale supply, with the retail markets of New Orleans and Natchez. Franklin's first recorded slave sale in New Orleans took place in 1828, and the following year he took a 2-year lease on a house with adjoining vacant lots in Espland and Casa Calvo, now the continuation of Royal Street, just below the French Quarter in the Faubourg Marigny, renewing it 2 years later. He seems to have kept his inventory of slaves for sale in a prison on the premises. So he kept them close. He lived with them. He wanted to be with them. A curiously ambiguous clause in his 1831 lease renewal stipulated that the lease was a dwelling house and not for the business which said with the said Isaac Franklin now carries on, that is to say, that the selling of Negroes, although it is not the intention to deprive the said leasee of the privilege to keep his slaves in the said house and therein to carry on his aforesaid business. So basically, they wanted him to stop trading in slaves at the volume he was trading in slaves. Though the District of Columbia was an important slave exporting outlet, it was quickly overtaken by Richmond. Virginia's capital city was the greatest intake center for the slave trade, where traders could buy locally raised people for trafficking down south. Because Richmond traders sold fast in quantities, too busy professional resellers in a high volume competitive market, they conducted a high proportion of their sales by open outcry auction, the kind at which the people being sold were routinely and ritualistically stripped naked and examined, typically in another room or area off to the side. Richmond's power, let me add here that they often did that stripping and examining in public areas. The authors here say in another room or off to the side, trying to add a bit of humanity to what these people actually did, trying to say that they did not publicly humiliate their enslaved property. That's not true. They had us on display, full spectacle, ripping and tearing our clothes off if we had them on. We were dressed in rags. They felt us up and down. They touched us in all types of inappropriate ways in an attempt to test the goods before they made their purchase. Continuing. Richmond's power was supplemented by a big local market for rented slaves or urban slaves, since the town's tobacco factories always needed labor. Having a partner in Richmond was the key to a successful national slave trade operation, and Franklin's man was Rice C. Ballard, whom he and Armsfield had encountered at Eli Legg's Tavern in Alexandria. Ballard, too, had his eye on the long distance interstate market. He was already selling slaves into New Orleans and Natchez by 1828, if not earlier. Now, they focus on these years from 1810 to 1828 during the height of the Jackson years, and they highlight this time frame as the slave trade was its most profitable for people because the people became highly capitalized because the crops that they turned over couldn't raise enough money for them, and because They had so many, under Jackson, they had so many different monetary systems because different banks could print their own money. The way that they were able to hold on to their wealth was to trade in slaves. So slaves became highly capitalized. The forecast says exactly in front of a crowd, customers and all, they examined us. We were there, bore naked. Arbiter 567 says the middle passage was so sad, couldn't imagine the horror. None of us can imagine the horror. And white authors often whitewash the true traumas of the middle passage, trying to add notes of humanity uh, in these slave traders and in these slave raiders. But the truth is that they had none. Not when it came to their black enslaved population. They continuously, at all times, felt it necessary to dehumanize us in each and every way. You couldn't have a spouse because you were told to with who to breed with and when to breed with them. And sometimes that was the white slave master, and sometimes that was another enslaved person, a big buck that they wanted you to breed with as a woman. You had no personal autonomy. You had no personhood. You were bred like cattle. And that's why they called us chattel, movable property. Ballard's friends addressed him as Colonel, which was and still is the honorific of an auctioneer. Though Ballard was based in Richmond, he shipped slaves out of Norfolk, which was Virginia's major seaport and where Franklin and Armsfield's ocean going brigs could make a stop. Franklin formed a second high volume partnership with him that worked in parallel with his Armfield partnership. Franklin was the business visionary, the senior partner, the big picture guy, the strategist who directed the other partners by mail and made the far flung parts of his organization work together. He handled the point of sale where the money was made, and he handled the banking. He created a slave trade operation that was national in scope in a way that no one had done before or would do after him. From a base in Tennessee that was very near the president's. Retail slave prices could vary by the day, but Franklin called the shots for when to buy and when to hold off. Besides watching market conditions carefully, he also paid close attention to crop forecasts, credit conditions, and political threats to the slave trade. And most important, to keep the firm's cash flow moving and maintaining its credit in A1 condition. So Franklin watched the market for slaves the way we watch the stock market today. But again, remember, we were the first things to be traded on the stock market. Every year, Franklin passed tens of thousands of dollars to Ballard and Armfield in the form of drafts on any of 8 or so northern banks. So he only used 8 of the banks to draft his ledgers on, to draft his debts on, because those were the most reputable. In return, they sent him young African Americans. He success now they say African Americans because, and the distinction here is that these were not the enslaved people directly from Africa, first generation. These African Americans were bred on breeding farms and in plantations. So these are the homegrown bred slaves because the transatlantic slave trade had ended. This was the intra American slave trade. He successfully addressed the problem of a decentralized slave supply network in the Chesapeake by building a region wide web of slave harvesting associates who combed the plantations of Virginia and Maryland as per the firm's advertisement that ran in every issue of the Daily National Intelligencer and other papers during large parts of 1833 and 1834. Their 1828 advertisement had solicited purchase of people between the ages of 8 and 25, but now the lower age limit had moved upward to 12, presumably reflecting Louisiana's 1829 prohibition of children under 10. The ad said, "Cash in market. We will pay cash or any number of likely Negroes of both sexes from 12 to 25 years of age, field hands, also mechanics of every description. Apply to R.C. Ballard and Company of Richmond, Virginia, J.M. Saunders and Company of Warrenton, Virginia, George Kephart and Company of Fredericktown, Maryland, James F. Purvis and Company of Baltimore, Thomas M. Jones, Eastern Shore of Maryland, or the subscriber at their residence in Alexandria. And the significance of all these different places is that he had a multi state network of people he was working with to acquire the enslaved people that he wanted to obtain. Persons having likely servants to dispose of will do well to give us a call, as we at all times will pay higher prices in cash than any other purchaser who is now or may hereafter come into the market. All communications promptly attended to. Signed, Franklin and Armfield. So that was a clarion call to all slave owners that had property they wanted to get rid of, that had enslaved people they wanted to get rid of, whether it was an unruly slave or a woman that wasn't fertile or a man that was unruly or a woman that was too that they wanted to ship down river, things like that. These were the people that they were combing in, they were clarion calling to get these enslaved people out of the hands of their slave owners. And they were able to pay such high prices because they traded in dollars that were cheaper. He only used 8 banks. So they traded in dollars that were cheaper to use in that area. So they had the capital, the slaves that were going down south where they could make more money and make more profit off of them and get more benefit off of them. Think of it like a foreign transaction. So if they were in Maryland trading money for slaves, and then they took those slaves down to New Orleans or down to Mississippi or over to Tennessee, they could get more money and be more liquid in those assets as they were trading those slaves up and down the river. Shipping by water, Franklin and Armfield at first followed the prevailing practice of consigning slave cargoes to captains as necessary, but then, marking a new level of national reach and vertical integration for a domestic slave trading company, they went into carrying trade and establishing their own packet lines. The firm may have purchased the brig United States or the ship United States as early as 1828. 1828 was a pivotal year. Okay. Arbiter said, I learned that in Britain they invented stock companies, corporations in order to finance colonies overseas and eventually created the Royal Africa Company that sold stocks in the trade itself. That's true, but there's more to the story than that. And they underfinanced the Royal Africa Company There's a whole complicated history behind that because although some people got very wealthy, a very few Black people who did not identify as Black in the global sense sold their people off and got wealthy, like Tibet. Oh my goodness, I forget his name, but it starts with a T. Um, Tiputet, I think his name is. I'll have to look it up. Bear with me. But you have to remember that they did not allow Black people to capitalize on the slave trade the way that they allowed white people to capitalize in the slave trade. Okay. Yeah, anyway, 1828 was a pivotal year for them because during that time, Andrew Jackson was in power, the Trail of Tears was happening, the Native American population was dwindling. They were removing Native Americans from place to place, they were reclassifying people. So there was a lot happening in 1828. Three other brigs or ships were subsequently added to their fleet: the Tribune, the Uncas, and the custom built specifically for the needs of the domestic slave trade, the modern copper bolted Isaac Franklin. By establishing a packet line, Franklin and Armfield brought the slave trade into the modern world where time is money. At first, they announced they would sail every 2 months from Alexandria to New Orleans, but by 1835, they were sailing the 1st and 15th of every month, shipping over 1,000 slaves that year. Other traders would board their captives at Duke Street for as long as necessary at 25 cents per head per night. By consigning them to Franklin and Armfield for handling during shipment, the other traders, in effect, subsidized the firm's shipping costs. Franklin and Armfield's size and greater capitalization, in turn, gave them more clout for purchasing young people in the countryside as they began to enjoy the advantages of scale. So they were the largest slave trader and they had the most leverage in that market. Franklin's firm then was a modern business that, as Bray Hammond described antebellum enterprise generally, was served by water power, steam, and credit. Franklin and Armfield proudly advertised their vessels were fitted out as sail steam hybrids in order to steam up the Mississippi. Steam power was not usable on the open Atlantic until 1838, so the brigs had to unfurl their sailors down the Atlantic into the Gulf. It was not an easy sail down the coast, going against the Gulf Stream from North Carolina forward, but the last crawl was the worst. The 60 miles or so up the river from the Olivile Birdfoot of lower Louisiana to New Orleans was a long time shipping bottleneck that could take a month without steam. By steaming up the Mississippi as far as New Orleans and then on to Natchez, the traders could save precious time, turn their money around faster, and have fewer of the people who constituted their cargo arrive dead. This faster, safer delivery gave them a previously impossible competitive advantage in that highest priced slave markets. The Reverend Joshua Levitt, the co-founder of the New York City Anti-Slavery Society, who was allowed to go on board the Tribune in 1834, reported that the hold is appropriated to the slaves and is divided into two compartments. The afterhold will carry out about 80 women, and the other one about 100 men. On either side were two platforms running the whole length. one raised a few inches and the other halfway up to the deck. They were about 5 or 6 feet deep. On these the slaves lie as close as they can stow away. There does not seem to have been a standard security protocol for carrying slaves on the coast route. When Frederick Bancroft interviewed two people who had been carried south by sea on one of them, Nathan Ross, interviewed in Donaldsville, Louisiana in 1902, recalled having been taken down to the James River to Portsmouth, Virginia, circa 1846, then put on a ship with 30 or 40 others. He remembered that they were allowed to walk on deck and were only put into the hold at night when it stormed. By contrast, 72-year-old Washington Taylor, who had been taken to Richmond and put on a ship for New Orleans with some 80 others, recalled being kept in the hold all the time, except when there was a storm. Then, in Bancroft's summary, they were let out lest all should be lost if the ship sank. So there was no standardization in the way in which they transported slaves because it was a highly unregulated industry. Andrew Jackson wasn't interested in regulating the slave trading market because that's how he made his money. And he was willing to allow slave traders to do whatever they wanted to do to transport these people across the country. Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders listening with you. Thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate you for being here. We're on page 479 of The American Slave Coast, A History of Slave Breeding, reading about the old robbers. During the off season, Franklin and Armfield's brigs or ships carried commodities and occasionally ballast. They offered passenger fares on their line, but it's not clear how successful they were, as slave ships carried a stigma. These runs were dangerous. The potential hazards included not only epidemic and rebellion, but also shipwreck. The brig Comet, which probably belonged to Franklin and Armfield, left Alexandria in December of 1830 with 164 captives on board, but went off course and broke up on the coast of Bermuda. The British governor of Bermuda set the captives free, but Franklin had insured 76 of them, and he collected $37,555, or about $1 million in 2014 dollars, and probably closer to $2 million at the rate of inflation. The sum was left to the insurance companies to collect from the government of Great Britain, which in 1840 settled the claim. The Comet was followed 2 years later by the Economium, whose 46 captives were set free, by the brig Enterprise, which, while taking 78 African Americans from Alexandria to Charleston in 1835, was forced by bad weather to put in at Bermuda, by the Hermosa in 1840, and by the Creole, the most sensitive of cases, since it put in at the Bahamas as a result of onboard slave rebellion. Exactly what the slave owners feared would happen if the enslaved had the incentive of being freed by the British. A diplomatic standoff ensued that lasted for years as U.S. diplomats to Britain defended slave owners' rights and pressed for compensation for what was considered stolen property. When Franklin's nephew, James Purvis, as their agent in Baltimore, Franklin and Armfield poached Austin Woolfolk's business and even his agents, outcompeting him in every way. It didn't help Woolfolk that he had a reputation for dishonesty. His business fell off quickly, and by October of 1832, he was reduced to running a strange newspaper ad that ran for weeks in the Baltimore Republican and Commercial Advertiser that read, A. Woolfolk wishes to inform the owners of Negroes in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina that he is not dead, as has been artfully represented by his opponents, but that he still lives, to give them cash and the highest prices for their Negroes. That's an odd ad to want to run. Arbiter 857 says, I recently learned about maroon communities like the Great Dismal Swamp where people escaped and lived for generations of freedom. It's okay that you're interrupting. And sometimes I read the comments in line and sometimes I read them at the end. There's a lot to be said about the maroon counties, but one of the things that's what the Seminole Wars were about. That's where enslaved people were running to Florida and to other places in the swamp areas. But you got to remember that as they were removing the Native Americans and fighting the Seminole Wars, and they were frustrated about the fact that their enslaved populations were running away, they encroached into those areas and they went deep into those areas and into those swamps to try to reclaim their territories. And they, even though some of those maroon places were living peaceably and didn't necessarily want anything other than their freedom, they sent soldiers into those areas to kill the men, women, and children because they were frustrated and did not want examples of Black people running away to freedom. Hope Hull Slater, the major Baltimore trader after A. Woolfolk, began operating in 1835 out of Owings Globe Inn at the corner of Howard and Market Streets. He opened his jail on Pratt Street in 1838, digging a 2-block tunnel beneath the city's streets to hide his coffles as they went from headquarters to the wharf. And he continued selling slaves out of Baltimore until 1847 when he retired to Mobile. And the ads would read, Cash for Negroes. I wish to purchase from 75 to 100 Negroes of both sexes from the ages of 8 to 25 years. So these slaves weren't going to New Orleans, where the age was, you had to be over a certain age in order to transport those slaves down south, for which I will pay liberal prices. I can always be found at Owings Globe Inn, corner of Howard and Market Streets, Baltimore, and in my absence at any time, a lien left at the bar will be attended to immediately on my return. Hope Hull Slater. NB. I wish to particularly purchase several seamstresses and likely small fancy girls for nurses. Fancy girls were quadroons and octoroons. They were mulatto women that they were looking to purchase. And fancy girls, they say they wanted them for nurses. They say they wanted them for nurses, but they really wanted them for sex slaves. I will also purchase several families. Baltimore Republican and Commercial Advertisers, February 2nd, 1835. Small fancy girls meant light skinned female children, sellable as sex slaves. It was a discreet phrase, but not a mysterious one. Everyone understood it. The New Orleans market specialized in both selling difficult to dispose of vicious slaves to sugar plantations and in supplying high priced craftsmen, skilled domestics, body servants, and sex slaves, or the light skinned fancy girls for urban use, which means that some of these people had the opportunity to be hired out and they had to bring their money back to the plantation owner. And some of them were in brothels, and some of them were on the plantation. New Orleans was notorious for its slave auctions, but auctions seem to have constituted only about half of the sales. Traders did much of their business in private sale out of their own retail showrooms, clusters of which were located in both the French and English speaking parts of town. So never let them tell you that the French are on our side. Give me one moment. I think we have a troll who says, "You should see what my Arab people did. They were worse. They were, in fact, worse. In fact, y'all lucky the whites pander so much. It's the new keeping up with the Joneses, Anglo Saxons sucking up to ethnic groups. If this China or Arabs or a ton of other Eastern cultures." Not sure what you mean by that. I'm going to give you a chance to explain yourself. And we know that the Arab slave trade was worse and that the Arab slave trade is ongoing. We're talking about a particular time in history. Yes, the French people, didn't the French keep people enslaved on Haiti? Yes, yes, they did. The Natchez market, by contrast, did not have regular auctions, but mostly sold retail directly to cotton planters. Now remember, these cotton planters were acquiring cotton to sell to Great Britain because in Great Britain, they had their industrial revolution and they had the machinery to keep going, and they had a great demand for cotton because they wanted to continue their industrial revolution. So they were all complicit. So the slave labor that was here picking the cotton was for cotton to be sent to England. Greetings, APTV 13 Keys. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Out of a compound that housed several hundred captives at one time. From early in the century to 1860, wrote Frederick Bancroft, the Natchez market, apart from its actual location, changed perhaps less than any other large market in the South, for its patrons were mainly of the planter class. Natchez purchasers were mostly end users as opposed to the resellers who dominated the market in Richmond and were also well represented in Charleston and New Orleans. Natchez was a split level pair of towns. The city proper, high atop the bluff, 200 feet above the Mississippi River, was where the old Natchez aristocracy lived and where Isaac Franklin did his business. It connected socially and commercially with the rural planters. Down below, at the foot of the bluff, was Natchez under the hill, a sleazy row of taverns, gambling halls, brothels, and merchants who dealt with the river traffic. And this highlights the two classes of slave traders that were in business to have to trade slaves. You had the aristocrats who felt like they were paternalistic towards slaves, so they say, so they say. And then you had those that were the sleazeballs, the gamblers, the ones that held brothels, and the merchants who dealt in river traffic. A traveler from Kentucky wrote of Natchez in an 1803 journal that there are about 500 dwellings in this place. There are mostly Americans from South Carolina and Georgia. I suppose from what I have seen that Natchez is, or the inhabitants of the town are, as much given to luxury and dissipation as any place in America. Natchez was the crossroads where the major water route, the Mississippi River, met the major land route, the Natchez Trace. As such, it was the principal destination for coffles as well as boats coming up from New Orleans. At the end of the slave selling chain, Natchez consistently paid the highest prices. Natchez was Franklin and Armfield's cash cow. Now remember, Natchez was paying the highest prices because of how the dollars were being traded in different banks. And remember that different banks had different trade values. And remember, Armfield and Franklin only dealt with 8 banks. So those 8 banks were probably giving them premium dollars. Louisiana's post Nat Turner prohibition on slave importation caused inventory problems. In a letter from New Orleans of February 28, 1831, Franklin wrote to Ballard in Richmond, saying, I will have a petition tomorrow before the House out for our relief. Should that fail, God knows what will be the consequence. I will do the best I can for all concerned, and if nothing better can be done, I will declare myself a citizen of the state. I am much depressed, and if we have to rely entirely on the Mississippi market, we have more in this shipment than can be sold to the advantage. In November, facing a wipeout with the closing to out-of-state traders in the Louisiana market, Franklin conveyed his entire lot of slaves to his brother and agent, James R. Franklin, in Natchez, who sold them all by December. After that, Franklin didn't sail into New Orleans again until 1834. So from 1831 until 1834, after his brother sold all of his slaves in the New Orleans area, he didn't go back into that market until 1834, probably because of the way that that market was going. I'm sure that if Anthony McPhail were here, he could give us some additional insight into that. Meanwhile, Natchez was heating up as a spot for sales, but epidemics were a constant problem, especially after a global pandemic of Asiatic cholera reached the United States in 1832. Symptoms appeared almost simultaneously in Montreal, Philadelphia, and New York, writes Kipley and King, for reasons that are still unclear, but quite possibly related to the lower levels of sanitation available to the enslaved. The ravages of cholera were more severe among the Black population. Many physicians in the hemisphere thought of it as a Negro disease. So they thought Asiatic cholera was a Negro disease. And that even framing it that way, because we had the Wuhan flu and COVID and different things like that, even framing it that way is a part of their propaganda to say that these things happen in cycles. Arbiter 567 says the Southern planters established their own antebellum aristocracy like manor lords. They didn't want that system to end when the Civil War came around. No, they did not. No, they did not. And that is a keen observation, and one of the reasons why the Civil War happened in the first place, because for The North wanted to open up the labor market so that they had to pay the white people that were immigrating to America for the jobs that the enslaved population were doing for free. And they wanted to break into the economy that the slaveholding South had such a stronghold on. The slaveholding South did not want to give up their free labor because they were making money hand over fist. Cotton is king, old King Cotton. And they were making money hand over fist. Mississippi was one of the wealthiest states in the nation prior to the Civil War. And you have to remember that all Lincoln wanted to do was preserve the Union. He didn't care about slavery. We freed ourselves. Lincoln did not care about ending slavery or continuing slavery. All Lincoln cared about was preserving the Union that was the United States of America and to bring it under one system so that they had more pull in the global political market. At first, Franklin was afraid of the inmates of Ballard's slave jail in Richmond might die. But then he advised him to hold back from selling and wait for the prices to climb as the epidemic did its work. So what they're saying here is that the price of slaves was rising as this pandemic was going on. Just like the cost of labor gets more expensive as we had our COVID pandemic, the cost of enslaved people was increasing as they had their cholera pandemic or epidemic. He said, best hold on. The more Negroes lost in that country, the more will be wanting if they have the means of procuring them. On December 8th, 1832, he wrote Ballard of casualties from cholera. The last 2 weeks, we have buried 9 Negroes and 6 or 7 children, and we have 7 or 8 sick Negroes. The way we send out dead Negroes at night and keep dark is a sin. Buried was a euphemism because he hadn't buried them. To the great disgust of the polite citizens of Natchez, he opted to dump their bodies in a swamp, hoping to not be detected as he created a health hazard for the terrified town. That a slave trader could easily bring an epidemic of deadly diseases into town was part of the social stigma attached to the profession. Africans brought in on the earlier transatlantic slave ships had passed through a period of quarantine in a pest house. But there were no quarantines in interstate commerce. Yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, smallpox, cholera. Slave pens were a notorious breeding ground for epidemics. So, as they were so keen to capitalize on their profits and to make money off of the bodies of the enslaved, they didn't care. Sometimes they would even shine them up to hide illnesses. They would cut off hair to hide illnesses. They would give them enough medicine to make them seem well enough to go into the slave market for sale. Remember, they just wanted to make the money. Frightened by the possibility of a contagion in their midst, the citizens of Natchez kicked the slave traders out of the city proper in 1833, which was the year before Franklin and Armfield went back to trading slaves in New Orleans. They were banished only a mile out of town to a site where slaves were already being sold. The forks of the road, a crossroad where the ironically named Liberty Road, which led east to Georgia, crossed Washington Road, which led to the Natchez Trace and on to Tennessee. If Natchez was a crossroads, the forks of the roads was the crossroads of the crossroads. So they were all intersecting spaces. Q. Robert Johnson. Slave jails were often at crossroads. However, you care to read the image of the crossroads in the blues, remember that in Mississippi, the most notorious crossroads were at the state's largest slave markets, where Robert Johnson's great grandfather's generation was sold. Many locals referred to the forks of the road as Niggerville in the advertisement that ran in the Natchez Free Trader of February 26, 1835, where they said, Negroes for sale. The subscribers offer for sale at Niggerville, 1 mile from Natchez, 6 carpenters and 3 blacksmiths. They will be the first tried to as to their capacity in their different branches of business, with a full guarantee as to title and soundness of the same, to be disposed of either for cash or on time for good acceptances. So they were accepting credit for slaves. All persons that may be in want of such mechanics would do well to call and look at them before they are purchased elsewhere. Eaton Freeman, Niggerville, February 26, 1830. In a letter to Ballard of April 24th, James R. Franklin, the brother of the Franklin of Franklin and Armfield, wrote from Natchez saying, Our Negroes are getting much better, but they have been very sickly, so much so that the city council compels us to leave the limits of the corporation in 2 days. We shall have to take to the woods. By May 7th, in the dreary woods, amid sick and dying captives, and sick himself, James R. Franklin's tone sounded desperate. I do assure you it is dreadful. I have 4 or 5 down at present. But he held out hope that he could still sell his diseased cargo, saying, I am in hopes. All of the fools are not yet dead, and some one eyed man will buy us out yet. So, what he was saying is that somebody that didn't have a keen eye to study the slaves and know that they were sick would come and buy them. And that all of the slaves, though they were diseased, they weren't quite dead or showing symptoms yet. And he was trying to get them off as quickly as possible. The term one eyed man, which turns up at various places in the firm's correspondence, seems to have been a private but easily understandable joke. Maybe some dickhead will buy our inventory of slaves before they all die. In a letter of February 2nd, 1834, James R. Franklin warned Rice C. Ballard not to ship any more Negroes, giving him the bad news that smallpox had broken out on 2 or 3 plantations and that slaves imported by their firm were suspected of having brought it. Then, amid a litany of complaints about uncooperative banks and piratical customs agents, he wrote, I never wanted to leave any place so bad as I do want to leave this damned hole now. I have commenced upon a new year's work and am purchasing Negroes much faster than at usual fair prices, wrote Franklin's associate Jordan M. Saunders from the buying territory in Virginia to his partner David Buford in Nashville in April 1832. The boom was underway. Franklin wrote Ballard from Natchez that the U.S. banks and the Planters Bank at this place has thrown a large amount of cash into circulation because remember, banks could print their own money. Franklin was positioned to scoop up that cash. In a letter dated November 1st, 1833, he urged Ballard to buy heavy, reminding him that as to the money we can raise in a short time, any amount that may be wanting. He went on to advise him that we have sold all of our Negroes for good prices and good profits, except some old Negroes, say 18 in number. They will keep house until next spring if they do not die before that time. We could have sold as many more if we had the right kind. We sold men from $800 to $900 and women large and likely from $600 to $650. But then he complained, we have no young girl on hand. There are great demand for fancy maid. I do believe that a likely girl and a good seamstress could be sold for $1,000. That complaint was also personal. I was disappointed in not finding your Charlottesville maid that you promised me. You must keep ship all of the first rate house servants by the first shipment after you receive this. First rate house servants was, of course, another euphemism. The fancy maid was named Martha, according to a letter from James R. Franklin. She also answered to Big Cuff. I propose the term fancy. Walter Johnson suggested the word fancy refers to appearances or perhaps manners or dress. But the word has another meaning. It designates a desire. He fancies. The slave market usage embarked from this second meaning, fancy, was a transitive verb made into a noun, a slave owner's desire made material in the shape of a woman. So when they use the term fancy girls, they're talking about their desire that they fancy a girl, that they want a girl for sex. New Orleans was the capital for selling fancy girls, whose earnings could keep a riverboat gambler doubling as a pimp, not necessarily selling their services by the hour, but perhaps receiving regular rent on long term concubinage contracts, beginning at as young an age as 12. An anonymous 1850 booklet called New Orleans as It Is quotes a price of $12 to $20 a month for a girl to pay her owner until, as it goes on to say, she is cast off as a useless and worthless thing. So her entire life, she was an urban slave, keeping house with some non-black person as a concubine, and her owner was paid $12 to $20 at that time a month for her to be a kept woman. The wealthy planters of Natchez could easily afford to purchase personal sex slaves as luxury goods. Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard certainly dealt in them, and as slave traders commonly did, they graped them in the process. This was facilitated by the fact that traders generally owned the captives in their custody. Planters often retained ownership of their cotton until it was sold in Liverpool, moving it along through a series of consignments and commissions by means of huge syndicates they formed for the purposes of marketing their cotton. Remember, England was in the midst of its industrial revolution, so they wanted the cotton picked by the slaves for those cheap prices. Not so slaves, they were generally sold outright as they moved through each stage of the distribution chain. Slave narratives commonly mention having been sold 4 or 5 times, and 10 times over a lifetime was not unheard of. Since traders were the legal owners of the slaves they were selling, they could mistreat them any way they wanted. The law was quite clear that slave owners' power was absolute. The 1830 opinion of North Carolina Supreme Court Judge Thomas Ruffin in the North Carolina versus Mann case that the power of the master must be absolute to render the submission of the slave perfect, echoed through the South with its SA subtext intact. A trader was assumed to enjoy a surfeit of sex slaves. It was part of the culture of the slave trade, notoriety that contributed greatly to the general disrepute traders were held in. A number of traders remained unmarried, preferring to enjoy the sexual benefits of being in the slave trade. They were cohabiting with the enslaved women, who were quite frequently mighty near white, until perhaps they left the trade for a more respectable life. On the evidence of their correspondence, sexual exploitation was part of the corporate culture of Franklin and Armsfield. These fancy girls were the highest priced slaves, the premium class of the market, consistently outpricing even prime field hands because they will pay a premium price for their luxuries. While Franklin waited, to get to the best prices possible for them, they belonged to the firm. Wendell Holmes Stevenson, Franklin's admiring 1939 biographer, obtusely notes that Franklin was party to a sale in Natchez in which Chloe Ann, Yellow, age 16, was sold on June 30th, 1821 for $700, an unusual price for that period, unless the slave were a skilled laborer. It was not, however, an unusual price for a light skinned sex slave. The archetypal fancy girl was a quadroon, 1/4 black, 3/4 white, or even lighter. Not that black women didn't have to do sex work, but their owners commanded a lower price for it. So even then, there's a colorism thing when it came to how they priced us out as women and as men, because the quadroons and octoroons sold for a higher price because these white men thought that it was novel to be able to command a almost white girl to do whatever he wanted, to be able to almost kill her and unalive her if she didn't follow his orders. While awaiting sale in New Orleans, they might be sent from a slave jail for a night's work in the lower class of brothel to earn the trader some money. They didn't have to travel far for that. It was no coincidence that New Orleans had both the nation's largest slave market and was the leading city for prostitution, which also meant it was a pimp city, a profession that overlapped with gambling. New Orleans may have even out civilized her big sister city, Havana. In some areas of the town, the brothels occupied the windows and doors of every house as far as the eyes can recognize them, according to one writer. The heavier the slave trade got, the looter New Orleans grew. Franklin seemed to have graped a number of young women who were in his power. From this, we can infer that the sexual use of young women did not harm the prices paid for them, or he probably wouldn't have done it. Quite the contrary, it might have been seen as adding value as part of the enslaving process, so that the girls, officially sold as seamstresses or maids, would arrive having been broken in and be more compliant, a word that turns up in a letter of the Ballard Correspondence Collection referring to a female sex slave. Franklin had the Charlottesville Fair Maid Martha and Our White Caroline on sale in 1832. So breaking was something that happened to men and women, and they violated our men and our women in these physical ways, raping them and essaying them into compliance until they totally broke them down. Being a field hand must have been backbreaking tobacco or cotton or cutting sugar cane in the Caribbean. Sugar mills could catch fire and explode and even were sweltering hot. Yes, they were. Yes, they were. Franklin and his associates used their own peculiar lingo in intra-firm correspondence. Besides the previously noted one-eyed man, they referred generically to Black people as the stereotypical name Cuffy, Kofi, and a Khan name. Franklin jokingly referred to Rice Ballard as well as to himself as an old robber. The firm's extant correspondence contains barely coded references to the sexual use of captive women. As per Franklin's notorious letter to Ballard of January 11th, 1834, written from New Orleans as the Bank of the United States was contracting credit, Franklin began with the gloomy news that retail prices for slaves had not gone up there, even though the Nat Turner inspired importation ban that had closed the New Orleans slave market to him for more than 2 years was on its way to being lifted. He continued with an account of his depression in the face of low prices, continual rain and snow, the bad conditions of the upcoming sugar crop, and his fear of a concomitant downward pressure on the next year's market as surplus sugar hands would be sold rather than new ones being bought. Then Franklin transitioned into complaining that Ballard had not sent him the fancy girl from Charlottesville, whom he had previously requested, but whom Ballard had detained, asking, "Will you send her out, or shall I charge you $1,100 for her?" His spirits seemed to perk up as he began talking about the fancy girls they were passing between themselves. I thought that an old robber, in other words, Ballard, might be satisfied with 2 or 3 maids. In a postscript, he began fantasizing about another kind of business operation. The old lady and Susan could soon pay for themselves by keeping a whorehouse. Let it be kept for the benefit of the concern or our business. It might be established at your place, Alexandria or Baltimore, for the exclusive use of the concern and its agents. Franklin's notoriety for his sexual use of likely girls was such that a hearing over his estate after his death, attorneys for the plaintiff, who was Franklin's brother, against the defendant, who was Franklin's widow, tauntingly submitted as a cross interrogatory for 2 witnesses the question in describing the domestic comforts of Franklin's Fairview plantation. Was there at that place several very likely mulatto girls? One witness responded, There were, at that place, several likely mulatto girls. The servants that he kept about the house were all of the likeliest description, both male and female, though he hastened to add that all was above board. So again, he was doing this to his male and his female servants. Don't get it twisted. They had a pension for the women, for the mulatto women, but they had also this desire to exert this control over the men as well. We're almost done, guys. I know it's been a long read tonight, and I apologize for that. Andrew Jackson, the strong man of his time, owned about 160 slaves by the time he was elected president, which is to say, he was wealthy, but not super wealthy. There's no question that Jackson had been a slave trader, but like most of the domestic slave traders of his generation, he was a relative amateur in that business. Isaac Franklin was not. And even though Jackson was president, Franklin in some ways had better market information than his fellow Tennessean. We do not know how Franklin arrived at his decision to quit while he was ahead. Perhaps he was merely reacting fast to the increasing financial disarray that he had a close up view of, or perhaps he was activating a long term plan, or perhaps it was both. But only 70 years after starting Franklin and Armfield, Franklin announced his departure from the retail slave trade and took a quick, decisive step to exit the business, designating a New Orleans factorage firm to handle his affairs. He unloaded parts of the business onto his partners while retaining an ownership stake. So he got out of the day to day operations, but he still wanted to profit off of the commerce that they would continue to do. The forecast says it's crazy because the mulatto women was their daughters they were violating. Absolutely is crazy. And this was the mindset of these people because they felt like they were subhuman. They had this fetish. They had this sick fetish. His last known slave sale, Franklin's last known slave sale in New Orleans was on April 17th, 1835. An advertisement of March 6, 1836, in the Daily National Intelligencer for the firm's packet boat line the following year lists only Armsfield's name, and at the close of the slave selling season, the firm's name listed Armsfield first as per the advertisement of April 5th, 1836, which said, "For New Orleans, the last packet this season, the brig Uncas, Captain Bausch, will sail as above about the 20th instant. Persons wishing to ship will please make early application to Armfield, Franklin, and Company in Alexandria." An advertisement in the same paper of November 7th shows that the partners have found a one eyed man to take the brig off their hands. Washington City and New Orleans packets. The subscribers, having purchased Monsignors Armfield, Franklin, and Company, two of their splendid New Orleans packets, intend running them regularly between the two ports, leaving each place on the first of each month. The brig Tribune, Captain Bausch, master, will leave this place on the first of next month, which was December. The brig Uncas, Nathaniel Bausch, master, on the first of January. Those wishing to ship had better have their servants at this place a day or two previous to the vessel sailing. Servants can be kept at 25 cents per day. Freight and passage has theretofore. William H. Williams and Company. Now you see how they added an opportunity for them to make a profit in there, where they said those wishing to ship had better have their servants at this place a day or two before the ship sails. That's because that was another opportunity for them to make more money off of this particular voyage. It wasn't easy turning off the largest slave trading firm in the United States. But while Franklin didn't manage to extricate himself completely from the long running business issues, he was way ahead of everybody else. With perfect timing, he cashed out just before the Panic of 1837. Franklin exited the retail slave trade at the peak of the boom and managed a substantial, though not total, escape before the crash. He had moved any of his obligations into other shoulders by the time Jackson's specie circular shook the American finance, and did well when others were vulnerable. Franklin was a man of gentlemanly address, as are many of these merchants, and not ferocious. Captain Kidd looking fellows, we Yankees have been apt to imagine them, as Joseph Holt Ingram described him without being so indelicate as to mention him by name. Ingram, then a young clergyman with literary ambitions, went on to explain that slave traders' admission into society, however, is not recognized. Planters associate with them freely enough in the way of business, but notice them no further. Franklin was, however, a determined social climber, and after he became very wealthy, he changed direction dramatically at the age of 46, transforming himself from a despised slave trader into a respectable planter with an increasing fortune. Though he had created the basics of a functional corporate structure with interregional reach that had made him very wealthy, he seems to have been thinking not in terms of building up a permanent, expendable company, but of enriching himself enough to jump to the next social station. From his new platform, Franklin worked nonstop to further develop the ample resources he had acquired during his career in the slave trade. So he wanted to rebrand and reinvent himself. He wanted to distance himself from the disgusting slave trading, dirty business that got him all of his wealth. And you see this a lot with a lot of slave traders and with a lot of businessmen in general. They do the grimy work to make their money because that's fast money. That's money that they can use to leverage to finance other business opportunities. And this is the type of knowledge that they pass down to their future generations, that you do the dirty work to get your money up, and then you try to clean your money up by going into a respectable business. In 1830, Franklin acquired a prime tract of land about 4 miles from Gallatin, Tennessee, up the Cumberland River from Nashville, in a beautiful bluegrass region where buffalo had once run. But by that time, they had pushed through the Trail of Tears, and the Native American population had been removed because they killed the buffalo to starve out the Native Americans. That's the significance of saying that. First, he put up an overseer's house, then slave quarters, then a mill and a gin. After that, he built the mansion of Fairview, which he filled with perhaps $10,000 worth of furniture, then a garden, a yard, an ice house, and a stable where he kept blooded horses. He put his slaves to work raising cotton and food crops that he could sell downriver to Nashville. Fairview was the grandest house in Tennessee. After Franklin's untimely death, a neighbor testified that The house and everything in it is finished and most splendid and costly style. The mantelpieces are made of the finest Irish Kilkenny marble, which cost, as I understood from Mr. Franklin himself, $500 per mantelpiece. The house, in part, is covered with fine cedar shingles, which were painted before they were nailed on, and the other and flat parts of the roof were covered with copper sheeting. This house, is attached to it a beautiful yard, finely ornamented with a variety of shrubbery and a splendid garden that is decidedly superior to any garden I have ever seen in Tennessee. The yard, garden, and horse stables are beautifully enclosed with fine brick walls. There are two brick barns or stables and a great many brick Negro houses and a very splendid family vault enclosed by a superior stone wall. I am well acquainted with the improvements of the Hermitage, the house of General Andrew Jackson, and consider those belonging to Fairview Estate as decidedly superior to them. Now, listen, brick Negro houses were anything but common, but Fairview had and was a grand showpiece. Those houses were the public face of Isaac Franklin. He had made the transition. He was no longer a slave trader, a man who raped light skinned teenagers for amusement and dumped corpses in the swamp, but a reputable planter and a gentleman horse breeder. Such a fine house would surely find a mistress. According to an unsourced but not implausible story in the privately printed The Saga of Fairview, when, when Adelcia Haynes was brought by friends to see Fairview, she wrote in the guest book with a fortune hunter's frankness, "I like this house and set my cap for its master." She said she had had something to offer that he badly needed: respectability. He had something she wanted: that house. She was a 22-year-old Presbyterian minister's daughter, which put her almost past marriageable age, and he was a 50-year-old robber who made himself again, who had made himself over. It was the first marriage for both of them. The evidence of Franklin's prior career was discarded. One of Franklin's associates, William Cotton, with Ballard's help, whisked Franklin's enslaved mistress Lucinda and their child away to be sold in Louisville. In their marriage of 6 years, Adelcia Haynes Franklin gave birth to a son who died in infancy and three daughters, none of whom lived to adulthood. So that was justice in a way. His legacy could only be carried out through his brother's line and his other family member lines because he could not successfully have any children except for the child that he had with the enslaved woman that he graped for years. And then he sold her off down the river, down south, to quiet her away and to dispel any rumors. In his new career, Franklin continued to do business in slaves because that was what planters did. But now his commerce was on a higher level than merely retailing in flesh in a stinking slave mart. He was a financier, accumulating human capital through dispossession of smaller slave owners. There weren't a lot of different investment opportunities available in the all slavery South. Savings most commonly took the form of slaves, which in turn were viewed by lenders as almost risk-free collateral. Large slave owners therefore had lots of credit collateralized by their slave holdings, which they resold piecemeal to a smaller fry. These well capitalized individuals, whom Kilbourne calls accommodation endorsers, thus lent out their credit, writing mortgages heavily collateralized by the debtors' slaves. They foreclosed on the weaker members of planter society as they went down, appropriating the bankrupt estates in the process. A neighbor recalled that I have seen Franklin with his family boarding at the St. Charles Hotel in New Orleans. He had a very large debt uncollected, both in Mississippi and Louisiana, and was in the habit of renewing notes from year to year and taking mortgages and other types of credit, which required his attention a great deal in the winter season. Most mortgage lending was done privately using banks as amplifiers, as Kilbourne put it. At deal's end, the lenders either collected their interest or took over the collateral. And yes, that means banks were owning slaves and took over slaves because that's where the money was. In the latter case, they either sold the slaves and the land, taking the profit or kept them, realizing a capital gain and commanding still more credit. That's how Franklin came into possession of his other signature property besides Fairview, some 4,800 acres of prime land in East Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, that had formerly belonged to an unlucky man named Francis Ralph. Franklin began acquiring the property which Ralph had acquired from different owners by purchasing a one-half interest on May 29th, 1835, when Ralph's finances were faltering and Franklin was transitioning out of the slave trade. The property already had three developed plantations on it, with the French, Irish, and Scottish nostalgic names of Bellevue, Killarney, and Lochman or Lochlomond. After Ralph was ruined by the Panic of 1837, Franklin purchased the other half of the estate at two sheriff sales, one on December 22nd, 1837, and the other on January 7th, 1838. An appraisal of February 26th valued the entire property at $159,507. Almost 60% of that value, or 94,950, resided in the 224 individually named and expertly appraised slaves of the three working plantations. An enslaved man named Thomas Jefferson was worth $350. Plato Goodwin was appraised at $600, Nellie at $400, and her child French at $150. Catherine, 1 year old, at $100. Only two of them, fewer than 1%, were worth four figures, and unlike any of their others, their professions were listed alongside their names. A blacksmith named Claiborne was worth $1,000. John Theodore, a carpenter, was worth $1,500. There were 134 slaves at Bellevue, the best developed of the plantations, but there were only 47 at Loch Lomond and 43 at Killarney. This density of slave labor, low for a plantation, was because much of Franklin's Louisiana land was still undeveloped. He was set up to work building it up. Bellevue became Franklin's residence when he was on the plantations, which was as little as possible. Although the main dwelling house wasn't up to the luxurious standards of Fairview, it did have the basic comforts, including a piano. So, after building this grand estate and acquiring a respectable Presbyterian minister's daughter as a wife, he went and started building up another estate because he wanted an even grander place. He migrated north to Fairview annually when the sickly season of summer settled into Louisiana and people began to die of yellow fever and other diseases. Then returned to the South in mid October to develop his Louisiana properties, which entailed putting up buildings and acquiring slaves and machinery. After giving Ralph and his family some compassion money and evicting them from the property, Franklin began developing a fourth plantation to be sufficient for 60 hands on some of the estate's uncleared land. He set it up as a sawmill and grist mill, feeding it the timber that grew in profusion on his plantations to be, and tried selling Spanish moss harvested from the trees. He gave his newly developed Louisiana plantation a curious name. He named it Angola. So, as you can see, this man tried to whitewash his own history. Arbiter 567 says a lot of money to be made with ruthlessness and having no conscience. When I was talking about the fact that you could use unsavory methods to get your money up, and then once you got your money up, you clean your money up by getting into respectable businesses. That's what they do. That's not who we are. That's not historically been who we are or how we are. If anyone would like to come up and discuss these things, please click the link. But as you can see, he figured out a way to whitewash his money. He figured out a way how to cleanse his money and rebrand himself. He married a preacher's daughter in an attempt to cleanse himself and to absolve himself of his sins. You see that he and his business partners were horrible men. They were horrible men. And the reason I say that they were horrible men is because they were passing around enslaved women, enslaved fancy girls, like they were nothing. And as they were passing around these enslaved fancy girls, they were complaining to one another about the fact that they didn't have the ability to receive them. And he even threatened his colleague to say, should I charge you the $1,100 that this fancy girl is going to cost me because I want her company? Because he wanted his company. All right, so that black enslaved trader was Tippu Tip, Tipputip, Tippu Tip. That was the one that was involved in the uh, Arabic slave trade and the trans-Arabic Saharan slave trade that traded so many enslaved people. And you have to remember that again, they never allowed even their conspirators in the Black community, they never allowed the African to capitalize off of the slave market the way that they allowed the whites to capitalize off of the slave market. Thank you so much, Forecast, for the compliment. He said my teaching was great tonight, was on point tonight, and that I did a great job. All right, guys, that is all we have for tonight. I will be back on Thursday reading from Niggas to Gods. We are getting into the thick of it. and we're almost at the end of the first book, and then we're going right into the second book when we do finish the first one. I thank each and every one of you for being here. I want to thank the forecast, Arbiter 567, KW Don 7, APTV 13 Keys, shout out. I want to thank Sister Raw and the elders that listened with you. And I want to thank MG2 for being here. I know that Bawana Haguziki is listening. I know that Riri 92 is listening. I know that Peggy is listening. I know that so many others are listening, like Koku from the Bitter Medicine podcast, which you should listen to, Forecast, whom you should tune into when he is live, and Oni Tase from the Pro Black Perspective. I thank each and every one of you for being here tonight. And remember, they were all complicit in our enslavement. They were all complicit in profiting off of the bodies of Black people, off of the chattel slavery system. Whether it was England, who wanted the cotton at lower prices to fund their industrial revolution, whether it was the Irish or the French or any of these different people groups. They all profited off of the enslavement of Black people, because when you don't have to pay for labor, you get to pocket more profits. And remember, they began to capitalize us heavily at the point that their money systems were beginning to fail and falter. So, what they did is, instead of being able to put the money into the money in and of itself, they said that the Black people themselves, that our very bodies were the money. Thanks each and every one of you for tuning in, and I will see you on Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Peace, guys.